Welcome back. Today, going to be making some modular slums. To start with, constructed some frames out of some foam core. Mostly sticking to a block shape, but also having an L-shaped one, as well as having some slanted walls on them. I then attached these to bases and kept them to a low profile so that they would fit quite snugly together. This would let them be used in various configurations as well as sit up right next to other buildings. The next step was to bevel the bases with my Opinel knife. Once happy with the base shapes, the next step was to attach a few various features, such as bamboo skewers to represent poles and steel pipes sticking through them. This would also go to help support the frame and make it a little bit tougher. I'm using a different type of corrugated cardboard from how I normally do. I normally use a type with a metal finishing on one side, which makes it a bit more resistant to water and a little bit stronger. But this is like a purely matte finish, and as such, it is very easy to crumple and make it appear a lot more ratty and knackered than it normally is. So, measuring out the walls, cutting them into rectangles, and then crumpling them up between my fingers, then attaching it over the foam core. And you can get some nice effects by overlapping plates, which makes it appear to have a lot more depth. It's also worth keeping some of the parts uncrumpled, so you get a nice contrast between newer and older metals that they have scavenged. You can also break up a fairly basic looking face by adding some angled sheets over the top, as well as bending pieces, so you get a nice blend over the corner. It's also worth adding a doorway, but if you forget, you can just cut one out of the side with a knife. Using balsa wood, I added a bit more detail onto the sides, and covered up some of the seams in the corners, as well as adding a bit of planking on the ground as well. On one of the huts, I added a bunch of planks leaning against the walls to add a bit more support. Then I moved on to the basing paste. This is what happens if you add too much water, you get a too liquidy paste. So if that happens, just leave it out for an hour and it will thicken up. I then applied it over the base and on the very bottom of the walls as well. While that was drying, I pushed a few small rocks into the base, as well as blended the edges of the foam core where there was a little bit of an edge still showing. Once dry, I went on to give everything a layer of black gesso. You might notice here there's a few bits that don't have any cardboard or anything covering them, and you can see the foam core below. These areas will be covered up later on, after the painting is done. After the primer is dry, move on to a base coat, using an umber brown. It doesn't matter if this isn't consistent, as that will give a nice little effect later on, with varying levels of rust. I wanted to add a bit more damage to the walls, and normally you should do this before painting, but I full on forgot. So, using a pin vise, as well as this little spiky tool I think I got from an airbrush once, just going in and stabbing holes in the walls. It's also worth altering the size of the holes and wiggling the tool around a bit, just to get some different sized calibers that have been fired at the wall. To add a bit of colour variety, going to pick out some of the sheets in green and orange. With everything fully dry, going to take some metallic paint and an old sponge and start dabbing it all over the corrugated sheets. It's worth rotating the sponge while you're doing this, or cutting another piece of sponge entirely, so you get some variation on the patterns you print out. Using a tan colour made from the same brown as earlier, mixed with some white paint, going in and picking out the wood grain, as well as giving a light dry brush over most of the piece, concentrating mostly on the base of the model and the lower half. This will serve as weathering, and it will also act to mattify some of the metallic, and make it a bit less glossy. With most of the painting now done, moving on to a few final details. So with some diluted PVA and water, taking some tissue, cutting it into rectangles, and then applying it over any of the gaps where the foam core is still visible underneath. I also use this in most of the door frames to make a simple covering. If you want to make a covering from the inside, you can cut a hole in the middle of the base and then push the tissue paper up from inside. For painting, using some very diluted acrylic paints, letting the capillary action do most of the work for you. I went for a light blue as well as a green, so it would stand out against the brown. But something to be wary of is that these colours will lighten up when they dry because they are so heavily diluted, and they will appear darker while they are wetter. Before these are fully dried, to tie them a bit into the weathering, just taking a few dabs of brown, and again, while the paint is very wet, just adding a few drops to blend them in. For a bit more depth on the rust, going to stipple some orange paint over the top of it. So with an old knackered brush, just dipping that into the paint, and then stabbing it into the walls. And you don't want to go too heavy on this. Just pick a few choice areas and give them a nice stabbing of orange. Finally, we're going to bump up the highlights. So with a very pale tan, almost white, we're going to go in and hit the wood as well as the stones on the base, so we can mostly hit the edges and make them pop a little more. It's also a good way to pick out the wood grain on the sides of the balsa planking. With that dry, we're done. We have some nice little slum buildings, so you can make your own little dedicated slum, or put them next to other buildings. With the relatively flat roofs, they're quite playable, and you can get some nice little configurations for something that will work in a sci-fi game, as well as a modern setting. But anyway, thanks for watching, guys. Catch you next time.